Hi, cuties. I hope you guys are doing well. Hope you like my second super cool hat. And I hope that you are ready to kind of come to a close here with our last couple of lessons together. And this one is about the evidence that we have for evolution. So you might say, oh, well, I don't believe in evolution, but this is a scientific theory which has a lot of support, it has a lot of evidence that we can look at right now to help us understand why this is an accepted theory in science. So, is it true that we came from monkeys? No, that is not true. We didn't come from monkeys. We share a common ancestor with them, but we didn't come from them. Is it true that the evidence for evolution is incomplete and contradictory? No, it is not true that evidence for evolution contradicts itself. Yes, the fossil record isn't 100% complete, but we have solid evidence for the theory of evolution. Is it true that Mrs. Culp is the best teacher ever? Yes, we don't even have to argue about that. It just is. So there's three kinds of evidence that we're going to talk about that support this theory of evolution. Now, keep in mind, there are other things that we could discuss, but we're going to focus on these three things. Firstly, the fossil record. Second, anatomy and development. And thirdly, molecular or genetic evidence. So if we take a look at this picture here, this is kind of showing you a really cartoonish, simple version of the fossil record in the sense that when scientists find fossils, they basically know that the ones at the bottom, the lowest that they could find or they have found, are the oldest. And as we go up the different strata, we have fossils that are younger. So you can actually see in the fossil record how species have changed over time. So if we pretend like this little shape here is a species, you can see that over time it has gradually changed or evolved. Same thing with even humans. So our pre-hominid, pre-Homo sapien ancestors, all the way back to 2.8 million years ago on this, 28 million years ago on this scale, are shown to have slight slash major differences as we go through kind of our human evolution to get to Homo sapiens, which is what we are. So you can see in the fossil record how species have changed over time and see that evolution really occurring based on how deep these fossils are in the different layers. So what is a fossil? If you're going to tell me what a fossil is, it's just a remain or the traces of an organism that has been preserved in some way. It could be actual bones, like what we just saw. It could be animal tracks. It could be shells from an egg, or even the whole organism might get preserved, like insects in amber. So it just depends on what we're talking about here. But a fossil is just the remains of that organism in some sense. So when we talk about the fossil record showing us evidence for evolution, we can see something like our modern horse is pretty different and yet has a good amount of similarities to the horse of many, many years ago. And you can see how that species has changed over time due to the fossil record. So Darwin, even in his time, who, if you remember, is just the guy who came up with this kind of concept of natural selection, um, he compared fossils from old and young rock layers and also saw this same kind of pattern where extinct organisms had some kind of relationship to current living species. So he saw that in the fossil record even back when he was just kind of adding to this theory that we now hold as true. Transitional fossils, like you might have seen in that picture with the horse or the human, basically show how we go from the oldest member of this prehistoric species all the way to modern versions of this species. So fossils really help us see how a species has changed and evolved over time. So you can see this relationship in fossils, but you can also see this relationship in the fossils of different species. So if you look at the skeleton of different organisms like a gorilla, chimpanzee, orangutan, gibbon, and man, okay, humans, you're going to see some similarities, and you're going to see obviously differences, but you're going to see similarities in their skeletal structure that kind of point us to our second source of evidence for evolution, which is anatomy. So the fossil record, although not perfect, yes, there are gaps in there. That's not a sign of weakness. It just says that we're going to keep adding to our theory the more fossils that we find. But basically, when we put these fossils in chronological order by time, we can really see how a species has evolved. And there are always going to be gaps because there's always going to be things that we are constantly finding that are new, but we've added more and more to our fossil record to really support this theory. So keep in mind that when we talk about the fossil record, how do we know something's old? Well, besides being able to do like carbon dating and other methods of isotope, I can't even speak, isotope dating, we can just use literally the position in the layers to know how old something really is. So when we compare species changing over time, we are looking at anatomical differences, anatomical similarities, and we are going to give specific names to the structures of their body that we're going to say show a relationship in terms of evolution in a couple different ways. So one kind of structure that we are going to mention is homologous structures. They are structures that have a different mature form, meaning they look kind of like differently ultimately at the end, but they develop from the same embryonic tissue. Okay, so homologous structures are essentially ones that might look different when you look at their mature form or kind of the end product here. A human arm doesn't look exactly like a cat arm or a whale fin or a bat wing. However, these bones inside of them are made from the same kind of embryonic tissue. So we know that whales and bats and cats and humans are actually pretty closely related in terms of our evolutionary history. So those are homologous structures. The deltoid muscle that cats and us and dogs share, it might look different in a cat versus a human versus a dog, but they came from the same kind of tissue because we have a recent common ancestor. So homologous structures don't necessarily look the same on the outside. A lizard arm, a bird wing, a human arm, a whale fin don't all look really similar, but they're made of the same kind of stuff because they have a recent common ancestor. Things that are not homologous would be like an octopus arm or a sea star arm or a grasshopper arm. They might like do the same thing, they're not really made of the same stuff. So those are homologous structures. The other word that we're going to focus on is analogous structures. Analogous structures actually have a similar function, but they're not really made of the same kind of stuff or made from the same tissue. This is not something that shows that you have a recent common ancestor, but instead it shows that evolution is at work here because these organisms might live in similar environments. A duck and a platypus both lay eggs. They both have kind of like a bill, not because they're super closely related, but because they live in similar environments. So analogous is a little different than homologous. Homologous doesn't necessarily look the same, but they come from the same embryonic tissue and they show a common ancestry. Analogous means that they might look similar or they might do the same thing, but they don't necessarily insinuate that there's a recent common ancestor, but instead it shows that these organisms live in similar environments. A shark fin and a penguin wing and a dolphin flipper are all analogous. They do the same thing. They help them move. But sharks and penguins and dolphins are actually not super closely related. They just live in similar aquatic environments. So the last kind of structure that we're going to focus on when we talk about anatomy being really one of the types of evidence for evolution is a vestigial structure. And I have a video here that's going to show you guys structures that are vestigial in your body. But essentially, what's a vestigial structure? It's a homologous structure that used to have a function in our ancestors but lost its function over time. So this shows that we have this relatedness to our ancestors or to other organisms, but we just might not have a function or a use for these things anymore. Snakes have pelvic bones, like you guys have a pelvis that's connected to your legs here. Snakes don't have legs. Why do they have pelvic bones? Because their ancestors had legs. You have an appendix. People can live without their appendix all the time. We think that it used to help our ancestors with digestion. So it doesn't necessarily have a function now that's super important, but it did. Same thing with ear muscles. If you're someone who can wiggle your ears, can you see that? I can wiggle my ear. That is not useful to me right now. But when we were able to move our ears like dogs, like, can really move them around, that helped us hear our predators or prey coming better. Wisdom teeth, tonsils, males having nipples, all of these things don't necessarily have a function now. But keep in mind that they used to have a function maybe in our ancestors, and we just have lost that over time. And it's not bad to have wisdom teeth. It's not hurting you to have an appendix. So that's why these vestigial structures are still there. Are still there. They haven't gone away. So this is just another anatomical piece of evidence for evolution. Another piece of evidence, really quickly, is embryology, looking at embryos during development. If you look at organisms that are closely related, they look really similar for a long time, or for at least a longer period of time. They show similar patterns of development in terms of the tissues that they have and the organs. And that shows a relatedness. If you guys look from early to late embryo development, fish, salamander, tortoise, chick, pig, calf, rabbit, human, you can't tell which one's which. And if you can, you're lying, because they look extremely similar at the beginning. And as time goes on, obviously they start to differentiate. But look, the thing that looks the most different a little earlier is like a fish or a salamander. That's because a rabbit, a calf, and a human, they're all pretty closely related. They're all mammals. So it's not until late in development that they really start to look pretty different. So embryology is another example of evidence for evolution, because those that are not closely related look pretty different early on in development. And the longer you look similar, the more closely you are related. And the last thing that we had highlighted at the beginning is molecular or genetic evidence. When we look at proteins or genes or DNA sequences in different organisms, we see evolutionary relationships. So if you look at a sequence of amino acids, remember amino acids make a polypeptide, a protein. When you bond them together, a more similar sequence indicates a more recent common ancestor. So a human and a horse might have a little more different in terms of the sequence of amino acids than a human and a chimpanzee. You can see those are really similar. Why? Because we're very closely related to chimpanzees. So the DNA with the most differences means you are least closely related. You have been evolving separately for a longer period of time. See this little lamprey over here? Not closely related to us at all. So if you look at the number of amino acids that are different in this particular polypeptide that they examined, it's lots of differences because we're not closely related. But us and a rhesus monkey have a lot fewer differences because we're more closely related. So when you examine the number of differences in the DNA, in the amino acids, in the proteins, you're going to see that those that are closely related, for example, a whale and a horse only have 5 differences in this particular polypeptide, but a whale and a moth have 27. That makes sense. A horse is a mammal and so is a whale, so they're more closely related, so they have less differences in their proteins, versus a moth, which is going to be pretty darn different than a whale. Lastly, we could throw this in there real quick, is biogeographical distribution. This is another piece of evidence that we might use to support evolution. And if you look at all of these different species, they don't live close to each other, but they do have a lot of similarities. Look at their face shape. Look at their body shape. That suggests a couple of things. Firstly, this kind of idea that you've evolved like analogous features. You have things that aren't closely related, but they look similar or do similar things because these organisms are have evolved to best fit their environment. Or it could suggest that they came from a common ancestor. And if you remember Pangea, when everything was all together, and they eventually were distributed all over the globe. You can see the same thing in islands. The inhabitants of like ocean islands might resemble a mainland species, which suggests that some migrant from that mainland moved to another island, and then now they've kind of evolved separately. So they're similar, but now they've become these different species. Same thing you can see here with these snakes, slightly different here in their biogeographical distribution, but they have a lot of similarities. As they moved apart from each other, they could have slowly changed and evolved into the different species, but came from a common ancestor. So keep in mind, to kind of sum things up here, guys, as we talk about evidence for evolution, it is a theory, but a theory is not a guess. Like any scientific theory, evolution as a theory is something that we continue to add to and change, and we continue to find evidence all the time. And as we get this new data, we start to think and add to this idea that we have so greatly accepted in science. So, as many scientific advances continue to happen, we went from just Darwin's kind of idea of survival of the fittest and being fit for your environment to now we have this whole theory of evolution that makes a lot of sense with all of the evidence that we have gathered. So, you guys can watch this crash course if you would like to learn a little more just all about evolution in general. But that kind of sums up all our pieces of evidence for evolution. And I hope you have an amazing day.